So welcome to today's webinar. We've got a packed session in terms of speakers today because this is such, I think, a big topic and one I think that we're all still kind of dealing with at this point is, you know, what does the future of work, the future environment that we're all operating in look like? And how do we also balance that, not just with the practicalities in terms of our actual physical space we all work from, but we also know the last year has also shown up lots of issues around inequality, and that's come through in the workplace, I think, as much in terms of the fair work agenda as anything else. So we've got quite a broad session for you today, touching on, I guess, the fair work agenda, but also that whole thing about what is the future of the office, what is the future work environment. So really delighted to introduce our four speakers to today. So we're going to hear first from Kyle Usher at NESTA, before being joined by Claire from the Melting Pot, who, as I'm sure she'll tell us, is busy setting up their new workspace. So they've had quite a journey in the last 12 months, and I'm hopeful that we'll also pick up a little bit around their Future of the Office report that's just come out. So lots of work been going on there. Then we'll be hearing from Gail from Carnegie UK Trust, looking at what's next for fair work in Scotland. So really looking forward to that. And then last, we're going to hear from Will from think tank Autonomy UK, and again touching on some of those issues around, I guess, 4-day weeks, the broader kind of sense of our work environment. So really delighted to welcome you to our session. Thank you for joining us, and given we're so packed today, I'm going to hand straight over to Kyle. So thank you, everyone.
Great, thanks very much. And sorry, it just took me a second there to get my my screen in order. So yeah, thanks, Naomi. Knowing who's coming up next and their areas of expertise, I really want to sort of set the scene somewhat, in the hope and expectation really that the other presenters are going to be digging into some of these themes and ideas more deeply. So I know that there's a good number of reports and action plans and things on this area. But for us, we've looked at this a bit differently. So I want to give you, firstly, a sort of hopeful glimpse of a future fairer and more flexible workplace and sort of what that can look like. And also show you a bit of a tool that can support organizations to support people who are in, you know, precarious work, and enable people to transition into sort of fairer, more sustainable work going forward. So that's what I'm looking to do in the next 10 minutes here. So yeah, I'm Kyle and I work for NESTA, who, if you don't know NESTA, we're the UK's innovation agency for social good, and we design and test and scale new solutions to society's big problems. Over the last couple of years, I've done a few really interesting bits of work looking at the future of work. The first one was Share Lab Scotland, which explored how collaborative economy models that we know and are familiar with through organizations like Airbnb and Uber, how they can actually work better for everyone. You know, the sort of the issues with the collaborative economy are well known, but how those models can be used with social organizations, community groups to bring about scalable social impact. The next bit of work was called This Must Be the Place, which hopefully you can see this animation on the screen just now, which is a call to action through a sort of creative and hopeful vision of a future sustainable Scotland that was looking at 3 areas. So how jobs, industry, and the natural environment can come together for a positive, sustainable future. And then thirdly is the work of our data science and visualization team that they've done to map precarious work into safe, secure, and sustainable work. And that's sort of a data visualization that we've called Career Causeways. So all of these projects are interested in what the future of our working lives can actually look like. And I think it's very important for us to have conversations about what we want the future to be, so that we can start to make the changes in the here and now to actually bring that future about. And I think that if we don't have these conversations, and for instance, the webinar today, we can sort of end up sort of sleepwalking into a future that we actually don't want to be in, or at least a future that doesn't work in the way that suits everyone. And we know that we don't want that to be, you know, unfair, unequitable, and that it only benefits those who are already most well off. We know that's what we don't want. So let's, you know, look at what we do want instead. So that takes us to this creative vision project called This Must Be the Place. And there's 9 scenes. I'm just going to very quickly just sort of look at 3 of them as kind of examples. We brought together a group of co-visionaries here from across industry and across sort of natural environment organizations as well, to talk about how we can use technology, people, and our natural assets to their greatest potential to have this more fair, more equitable and sustainable society. And I don't mean just sustainable in terms of environment, but actually, you know, sustainable work, sustainable jobs that we can trust will exist through shocks and you know, unexpected things like COVID. So this scene that we've got here is a sort of local community, and you can see that there's lots of these kind of home businesses that we've imagined here. And this is because we've seen through COVID that actually, you know, people not working in central cities and central offices so much could actually bring about a long-lasting change to our communities, and a change that could actually start up these sort of smaller home-based part-time businesses as well, you know, traveling sort of vans and things that you used to get. And I know there's been a lot of talk through the last 12 months, so actually a bit longer than that, around sort of 20-minute neighborhoods. And this is trying to sort of visualize this idea of community and play and work and home being much more closely connected. The second scene I just want to quickly show you here is around the office. So we spent a long time as sort of co-visionaries, there's about 25 of us in total, talking about, like, what is the office? What is the office? What's the office for? And I hope that Claire can go into this in a lot more detail with her work with a melting pot. But really, the things that seemed important were about community, you collaborating with colleagues and socializing, and that the office is maybe more of a choice. It's maybe more that you come in for a purpose to collaborate and meet with people, rather than necessarily just sitting side by side looking at different screens. So yeah, much more about community and engagement, and maybe actually that changes the structure of the office, the physical layout, what it's used for, how it operates, and what we do with an office itself. And then thirdly, just actually the flip side of that, how we work from home. We've been doing this for a long time now, and you know, we've maybe changed our setups, we've accommodated for work. I certainly have it in the corner of my room here. This is kind of my mini office, hidden away from the family and the kids and the pets. But actually, you know, home office life, home working can still change quite a bit. And again, you know, what's important here is that we're connected. We're connected with our families, with our communities. You can see up here on this to-do list that we've got things that are very work related, and then things that are about the community and about the family as well. So this idea of having this interconnected and more flexible working relationship. There are issues there, of course. You know, there's definitely issues I felt with trying to kind of keep work and home life separate and compartmentalize a bit and things like that. But actually, working from home has been great for me, and I want to retain a lot of the benefits of that when offices reopen. So this piece of work, and there's plenty of other scenes that are much more focused on technology and the natural environment, but I just wanted to pick up on these 3 just now, because I think it's really important that we think about what we want our workplaces to be like, rather than just kind of going back when we can to the same as before. We know we can do things differently. We know we can be more flexible and more accommodating. And for some people, it's been great. And for other people, it's been really difficult having sort of, you know, being isolated and things like that. But this piece of work is trying to give us an idea of how our working lives can look very different, how we balance work and life, how we collaborate, what are our priorities, and how do we prioritize our communities and our families for a better future. The second piece of work I want to just talk about is much more practical. This is sort of, you know, if that first piece was around the vision of the future, this one's about how do we get there? How can we control some of this or even help it to be a reality? And specifically, how can we support the transition to low carbon through work, and also protect against shocks in the job market, such as COVID and automation. So our data team have put this together. They've pulled over 1,600 jobs based on their skills and their work activities to make this initial kind of map of the labour market. And there's different things that are categorized here. One of them is the suitability of tasks for machine learning. That's this color chart here. And that's important because it's a risk factor that we know is coming. You know, whereas we maybe couldn't have predicted COVID, it's certainly not in the way that it's kind of transpired. We can look forward to we can look ahead, I should say, to certain shock factors like automation in a much more proactive way. But this map enables us to do some really interesting stuff. So I'll quickly just go through this. So if we take the job role as a shop assistant as an example, which has had kind of double shocks recently, you know, we've had COVID being a huge shock to shop assistants over the last 12 months, but it's also high risk of automation in the future. Well, if we take this job role, we can actually do some really interesting stuff with data science. We can look at other roles that are similar, either in their work activities or in the similar skills. And then we can move past that and actually think, well, also you've got the pay. How can we help people who are in these roles not just know what other jobs they could move into, but help them to do it and help them to have kind of a progression through their career. So I'm obviously just nipping through this really, really quickly just to kind of just to highlight it. But we can then actually map people to these things and say, if we add in a skill, 1 or 2 skills here, what can we help them to achieve? So this bit here is if they add in the skill of managing staff, then actually new roles again open up for them. So this is a sort of first step to broaden people's career horizons, but actually we can use this type of data to help people move from either industries that are shrinking or who are in precarious work or find themselves unemployed to take really smart decisions about their future job prospects. And ideally, it's about, you know, fair work, green work, sustainable work that people can move towards. So that's just 2 sort of demos I wanted to go through with you all just now. And for social enterprises, I think there are 2 main things here, because social enterprises very much sit between 2 worlds of sort of social impact and commercial approaches, which gives you a really unique opportunity, I think. I've talked about shocks a few times in the last 10 minutes, whether that be COVID or automation or whatever is next. But we know that shocks to systems open up new opportunities, you know, commercially. We've seen the good and bad of that during COVID. There's been a lot of, you know, opportunism, and people who are in a position to jump on things, making a huge amount of money out of it, and not necessarily for everyone's benefit. And it's usually those who are in a position to take risks or take up new ventures or have the finances to back these things who can benefit from shocks. But I think social enterprises can be in that bracket too, in really good ways. That your, you know, social aspirations as well as your commercial approaches can help to change faster than some other organizations. And that would be the two final thoughts really for social enterprises here, that as we have this big shift in work, there are opportunities that are emerging around sustainability and around flexible working that I think that you can jump on early. So yeah, shifting how you work early, whether it's about how you work, use your assets, your office, your storage spaces, all of those type of things, how they can be used in new ways. And actually then also be flexible to prioritize your staff and their current well-being and their future prospects in smart ways to make sure that your organizations you know, continue to be sustainable and really benefit from these changes that we have just now. So that's my final thoughts. I see Naomi's jumped back on to give me a nudge, but that's me done for now. So thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Carl. I'm not going to do much interruption in between speakers because we've still got quite a lot to fit in, but I've already written down lots of comments and questions, and I'm hopeful our participants and attendees today will have done the same in terms of coming up with questions they want to ask. So put them in the Q&A and chat as we go through, but already lots of thoughts triggering in my mind. And I'm delighted to now welcome our next speaker for today. we've had Claire on at various points, I think, during the last year as well. And I think I've followed some of the Melting Pot's journey through what's been an incredibly challenging year and a changing environment. But I'm delighted to welcome Claire back in today. We know we've been following the latest news from the Melting Pot. And I guess, we know that as part of your kind of coming back into the kind of the physical co-working space again, you've done quite a lot of work around what is the future office, looking at things around collaboration. So I'm just going to hand over straight to you to kind of share your thoughts on where you're at. What is that sense of that future of the office? And over to you, Claire. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I think it's the third time in a year. What a year. We're going to remember this one when we look back on our lives. It was interesting, this morning I was on another webinar podcast for Co-working Europe, and the Melting Pot's one of the first co-working businesses that suffered to recover. So they're being a positive news story for co-working hubs across Europe, and trying to instill confidence, I suppose, not just in the co-working operators, that there is a market out there. I really believe from this last week, being in our new space, we're here fitting it out. If it sounds a bit echoey, it's because I'm in an empty room. But yeah, just this last week, being with people again, it's really moved me in a way that I wasn't expecting. I've actually enjoyed working from home this last year and having the ability to focus, but I realise it's come at a price. Price to my mental health, my feeling of being in a team, just coping. I didn't really realise how much until this last week, being in the room with physically with other people and making stuff happen together. And I'd just like to encourage all of you watching, get in a room with your people again. It will make things feel a lot better. I suppose it's like, obviously if you've got good colleagues, you enjoy yourself, but yeah, people matter, and being in a physical environment together matters. So I was asked to talk about what's happened to us. I'll be brief about that, and what steps we've taken and what we see is next in terms of work and co-working, and how that fits into the Fair Work agenda. And so I'll maybe preface this by starting out that 17 years ago, when I had the idea for the Melting Pot, when it was just in its infancy as this really big, whoa, I've got this idea. Why isn't there an office that I can work in with other people that are interested in social impact, where we only buy a bit of the time that we need, or buy what we can afford, because that's all we can afford as individuals or non-profit organisations, and where the sum of the whole is greater than the parts. And I created, ultimately, that safe harbour. I thought it was going to be a safe harbour for people to enable them to start to scale, to grow and contract, so that they weren't wasting their money on rent of an empty room. And the storm came along. That storm of 2020 has come, and it ripped everything apart. Lots of people's lives, their businesses, it's still going to be unfolding for years ahead. But I am delighted, actually. It's possibly been the best thing that's happened. Everyone has talked about co-working in the last 12 months in a way that they didn't before now. And that kind of big focus on, well, what is the point of the office? I was always interested in getting a productive place to be at work, and I hate presenteeism. And maybe the conversations now about, well, what is work for? What is the workplace for? How can we get that better balance between what you do in an office if you have a white collar job and what you can do elsewhere? And how can we support people better to have more flexible working patterns that suits the complexity of 21st century lives and the needs we want? So yeah. The storm took us apart, and I'm delighted that we have a new partnership with Foundation Scotland, and have taken on the building that they bought as their headquarters. Like many organisations, that big national organisation has decided to move to a distributed workforce in distributed workplaces. We've taken on their building right by the city's, by Waverley Station, and we'll be able to turn that into a thriving hub for people making social impact. We know that people want to come back to the office. We did this huge bit of research, 4 months worth of what's the future of the office, what's the future of work, and the component parts are that people need COVID-safe workspaces. It doesn't matter whether you're working in a care home, in a school, or in an office. We all want to feel like we're not going to go away becoming ill as a point of going into work. Then again, we also don't want to become ill by having to work from home. There's different types of illnesses out there. So COVID-safe work practices. Flexible working was a really critical part of the evidence of this research. So people don't want to be stuck in 9 to 5, squeezing in, going to school, doing the school run, doing the school pickup, taking other caring responsibilities. They want more flexibility. I think this last year has taught us all that we work in different styles. Some of us need interaction around us, need the hubbub going on, and other people need quite a lot of focus space, focus time. But we don't need to work 9 to 5. We're not a factory. Most people are not in a factory situation. When we're talking about certainly co-working offices, there is greater flexibility. So how can we have, how can we support people to work flexibly? And that means different times of day, different times of the week, and in different locations. So the third area then of the research was about the blended workspace use. And that really means we don't sit at a desk. Have you, in the last year when you've been working from home, literally sat at your desk all the time? I mean, I know that I've sat on my desk a little bit too much at times, but I go and sit on the sofa, I sit on a chair, I walk around. Like, I want an environment that is, that allows me to move, to think, to create, and that isn't all sat at a computer like in a call centre and sat there in front of the screen. That is not the only element of work. Work comes in many ways. And then the fourth area of the research really picked up on this idea of the ideal commute. Nobody, we know this, wants to commute more than half an hour. 45 minutes tops, but ideally half an hour or less. It feels manageable. It feels like it doesn't absorb our life and take up all of our time. So the ideal commute is a critical thing in terms of what is fair work in the future. My family, I come from down south, as you can tell from the accent. 30 years up here doesn't do much for my accent. But my family are now, extended family, working from home instead of spending an hour and a half, sometimes up to 2 hours one way traveling into London for work. That's not fair. You know, the price of those train fares in and out of London, or for minimum wage jobs, is that fair? We need to see a distributed economy going on, and the Scotland's Towns Partnership doing fantastic work on the strategy for effectively better across the country, that balance between the cities and the rural areas and the towns all playing their part. And so for me, Fair Work going forward will give people a variety of where they can work, how they work. It gives them the community that supports them, and that can be your corporate community or an extended community they can work in. And it balances out where, when, how people work. I'm delighted that over this last year, we have gone through this horrendous journey. That seems like a very strange thing to say, but I know that the co-working world, the infrastructure that co-working hubs provide people, is now seen as a critical part of the country building back better. There will be an emergence of co-working hubs across smaller towns, rural areas, as well as in neighbourhoods in cities. And that's all being made possible by COVID, by people questioning how, when, where they work, by employers being encouraged at the idea of, well, maybe I don't need to have a full-time office for 60 people or 6 people. I can buy in bits and pieces of workspace, effectively outsource their workspace provision to their staff, and then get them together for team days, collaboration days, use a hot office, use a meeting room, bits and pieces. Let's take a more flexible approach to the future. We're going to need it. The economy is going to need it. 5-day-a-week jobs are going to become 4-day-a-week jobs, or you can be paid 4 days a week whether you work 5. Like it's going to be hard these next 5 years trying to rebuild from this. So building back better, the fair work. I know that we're really predominantly, for me anyway, talking about white collar work, and there's lots of different types of that. But when I think about the young people coming into whatever sector it is, but coming into white collar work, they are not going to be able to do that by working from home alone. They need to be mentored and apprenticed, and that means being in physical contact with their colleagues or with others around them that can give them that support. So I look forward to the next 5 to 10 years and seeing co-working hubs around the country thrive, and seeing employers and employees adjust to fair, flexible and remote work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Claire. Again, I've got so many questions. The key thing I wrote down as you were speaking was a thought that's going on in my head about static places create static thinking, which is quite interesting, I think. And I think we'll come back and touch on that. And I'm glad you led us into, I guess, that fair work agenda. And I know one of the thoughts I had in terms of introducing our next speakers, looking at kind of work in that broader sense, is the other thing that we've seen in COVID is not just the change to the traditional office environment, but we've all talked about inequality and that real difference between different jobs. And we know some people have no choice but to still go into a physical workplace, and that's drawn out some quite challenging conversations and challenging positions we need to think through in terms of opportunities and people from different backgrounds. In terms of, it's very easy for us to maybe sit and talk about work-life balance and flexibility, but how does that come through into lots of different workplaces? And I guess that's going to be some of the stuff I'm hoping I haven't touched on too much. But Gail, I'm wanting to introduce you now in terms of what next for Fair Work in Scotland, I guess, and I know you'll be touching on some of those points. So over to you, and then we'll just come back to our last speaker after that before Q&A. Thanks, Claire. Over to you, Gail.
Great, thanks, Naomi, and thanks so much for inviting me to speak today. It's great to be here, albeit virtually. I have a few slides, so I'll just put these up now, and hopefully you can see them. Just let me know in the chat if there's any drama in this coming up. There we go. So yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to start by saying a few words about the Carnegie UK Trust in case you don't know us that well. We are a charitable foundation, normally based out of an office in Dunfermline, although of course we are all working from home at the moment. And our charitable mission is to improve the well-being of the people in the UK and Ireland. That was the mission set for us by our founder, Andrew Carnegie, over 100 years ago. And it's obviously a very broad and ambitious remit. In practice, we focus on influencing policy and practice in the UK and Ireland in a way that we think can contribute to improving well-being in the 21st century. And as part of that mission around well-being, for the last several years, we've had a focus on fair work, what we call fulfilling work. That's the name of our project stream. And really it's about this question of what characteristics of work are good for well-being, what trends in the labour market are causing difficulties in well-being, what are some of the inequalities in the labour market, how do we unravel these, and how do we ensure fundamentally that paid work contributes to people's well-being and their prosperity. In the last year, like most things, we've been dominated by the impact of the pandemic and studying the place of good work in the COVID context. We produced at the end of last year a report called Good Work for Wellbeing in the Coronavirus Economy, which was trying to take this first look at what changes were happening to people's job quality, to people's working lives during the pandemic, and what are the implications for employers and for public policy in trying to manage manage the fallout of this, try and seize any opportunities that this pandemic has given rise to while dealing with some of the huge challenges it has thrown up. And we followed up with a report called What Next for Fair Work in Scotland, which we published last month, which is really building on the research we conducted last year, but looking afresh in the Scottish context, taking into account the Fair Work agenda that has been driven forward here over the last 5 years and thinking about the next 5 years at the juncture of going into the Scottish Parliament elections. So today I just want to speak a little bit about the findings in these two reports, just to provide a bit of context about what is happening to job quality, what are the implications of that. But I also want to focus in specifically on this question about the future workplace and speak a little bit about remote working during the pandemic and what comes next. So before I go any further, I just want to pause and clarify, what do I mean by good work? And you might notice that I use the terms good work, fair work, job quality, fulfilling work interchangeably. But as a framework for our analysis of job quality, the Carnegie UK Trust uses a 7-dimension framework, which I've laid out on the slide in front of you. You can see those headline 7 dimensions, and then the metrics that we tend to focus on are laid underneath. This framework was produced through an external working group process, which we convened back in 2018 with the RSA. But you'll notice there's a lot of overlap with the fair work metrics that are used in Scotland and the activities underway in Scotland around fair work. They map onto each other fairly well. And the key point really to register in this is just that we see fair work as a multidimensional concept. It's not just about pay or contract type, although those are really important, obviously, for people on low incomes and in precarious work in particular. But we also want to look at what is happening in terms of, does work promote good health? Does it improve your well-being? What is your relationship with your line manager, with your colleagues? What is your work-life balance? Do you have opportunities for voice, to use your skills, for progression? All of these are part of what we look at in our Fulfilling Work programme. So one of the questions that we wanted to get an early understanding of in our research, looking at COVID, is how has job quality been impacted by the COVID crisis? And the first thing to say, of course, is that the working lives have been changed in dramatically different ways, depending on your job and your personal circumstances. And it's really important to keep in mind there's the kind of 3 segments of society and how they've been impacted by COVID. Number 1 is people like me who've been working from home for the duration of the pandemic. Number 2 is people who have been in and off of the furlough scheme, who have perhaps not been able to get work, who have become unemployed or lost hours or their ability to secure an income. And the third group is, sorry, I've totally lost track of my third group. We did the people on furlough, people working from home, and of course, critically important, those who have been going out to normal physical work sites throughout the pandemic, and that of course includes key workers. So really important to keep in mind those 3 very drastically different experiences. So it's difficult to generalise, but as a summary, we've produced this scorecard looking at those dimensions of job quality. In health, safety and psychosocial well-being, we're saying that there's severe negative pressures in the immediate term and likely to be long-term impacts, particularly on pay and contract type, precarious work, if employers are seeking to adapt to the very difficult trading conditions caused by the pandemic and the recession. And of course, we're only at the early stages of understanding the impact on our physical and mental health of this crisis. Although on the flip side, there has been much more scrutiny on the role of good employment in supporting good health, which could take us to a more progressive direction on that going forward, perhaps. On work-life balance and job design and nature of work, we're seeing that there's different changes occurring for different workers, and we're only at the early stages of understanding the impacts, particularly thinking about those 2 groups, the people who have been working from home and those for whom working from home is just not really a feature of the job they do. And finally, on voice and representation, we're saying that there's been increased focus on the importance of this, There's been such a myriad of changes that have happened in how work is carried out. And you would hope that there has been a great deal of dialogue and consultation going on within workplaces to change the way work is done. But the reality is that employer practice is mixed, and there is perhaps a lack of understanding and practice on how do you have meaningful forums for consultation, mechanisms for worker voice in non-unionised settings. I said I'd focus particularly on remote working during COVID and after. And there are so many things that we could talk about here, but I just want to pick up on some of our thoughts and what has come through in our research and what we're preoccupied with now when we think about policy and employer responses. Our overarching assessment is that there is real potential for improved work-life balance through more remote and flexible working, but this opportunity is not shared equally across the labour market. As I've said, it has only been the experience of some people working from home during the pandemic. It is in fact still the minority experience. Although the numbers of people working from home have absolutely soared during the pandemic from about 6% to 43%, the minority experience. Everyone else has been in and off of furlough, or they've been going out to their places of work as normal. So it's really important when we think about the future of the workplace that we keep all of those types of jobs in mind. And in that vein, I think it's really important that we continue to realise not all jobs can be done from home. And we need to consider how to advance fair, flexible work in all its forms for more people, looking at things like job shares, minimum notice of shifts, getting more input into your shift schedule, compressed hours, all these other forms of flexibility that exist. And we know that it is disproportionately higher income jobs that can be done from home. So we need to think about that from an equity point of view. Home is not an equal place, and that relates not only to the fact that women are, again, still disproportionately carry out more tasks at home, more childcare at home, but it's also important to reflect that we have huge housing inequalities in this country, with private rented, people in the private rented sector, young people, people in big urban centres in particular, not that likely to have a home environment that is conducive for working in, that is pleasant at all to work in. And there's lots of challenges about who bears the costs, the additional costs of working from home. We know that working from home has implications for socialising, for social networks, for opportunities for creativity, stimulation, and ultimately, I think Claire was touching on this already, we need to think about what does it mean for progression, particularly for people just starting in the labour market, if they are working from home or expected to work from home more often. I think we're all coming to understand that most people do want to retain aspects of working from home going out of the pandemic. But we also really value the opportunities provided by a workplace office setting. So how do we deliver this flexible working, this hybrid working model that we're starting to use, this buzzword of hybrid working? How do we deliver that in a way that is flexible and fair for most workers? How do we reconcile the different needs and preferences in workplaces? And if there are more jobs that are able to be done flexibly and from home, that has implications for opportunity across the labour market. We need to understand the implications of this better, because there's clearly some positives. For example, if you live outside of a major job centre, or if you have disabilities, which mean travelling to work is more difficult, there's some real opportunities there if we have a greater stock of flexible working opportunities, remote working opportunities. But we need to think about the full implications, particularly for young people getting started in work. So just to wrap up, I wanted to just highlight some of the areas of recommendations in our report. We're looking at the role for employers, and a big part of that is just encouraging employers to make full use of the good practice resources that exist for working from home, managing teams remotely, for hybrid working. There's so much good stuff out there that has been developed and is free to access on the internet, from the CIPD, the CBI, Flexibility Works, TimeWise. And we're also calling on employers to evaluate the impact of flexible home working on their staff's wellbeing and productivity before they take any future decisions about its use. And key to that is finding ways to really meaningfully engage and listen to their staff. And there is a real need to ensure that employee needs and preferences are given adequate weight in decision making going forward. As we are an organisation that seeks to influence public policy, we also obviously are looking at what is the potential role of government in creating a conducive environment for fair, flexible work. One of our specific recommendations is that the Scottish Government should continue its funding to help extend and scale up the activities initiated by Flexibility Works and Timewise in Scotland over the last year, which they're doing some really fantastic work supporting employers and employer intermediaries and job seekers. But we also would like to see a more consideration of the policy responses to promote fair flex, prevent a widening of inequalities in access to work that's fair and flexible, to try and ensure that workers' interests are embedded in the decisions that get taken by businesses. And also, policy is going to have to respond to the changes happening in the labour market if there are more remote working opportunities, looking at things like the impact on our town and city centres. So that's just to give you a flavour of our recommendations and the ideas that have come through in our research. I know I'm at time now, Naomi, so I'll wrap up. Thank you so much for listening. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Gail. So much coming out of today's session. I'm just going to hand straight over to Will because I'm conscious that we want to give him enough time to speak, and I know there's already a few questions coming in. So I know my speakers have agreed to stay on for an extra 5 or so minutes today, so there will still be time for questions. But without further holding you back, Will, over to you. Thank you, Gail.
Great, thanks. And I'll cut mine a little bit short so we have time for questions, because questions are normally the most interesting things about these sessions. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for putting together such a great panel. I'm glad that most of the groundwork's been laid for the analysis of the future of work. I particularly appreciated Gail's presentation about the inequalities, particularly in the home. It's really, really important. My name's Will. I'm the Director of Research from Autonomy, a think tank which is about the future of work, a small independent think tank. We've been going for about 3 years now. We work on things like working time, welfare, more generous universal welfare systems, precarious work, one of our main themes of research, and also care work, given that many jobs over the next few decades will involve care work of some form or another, particularly in the situation of aging populations. So I'm here really to talk about working time reduction, which is one of our flagship policies and one of our flagship research areas. We design policy and research for national implementation, for local authorities to think about working time reduction within their workspaces, but also we consult with private sector firms, charities and so on who want to pilot working time reduction, 4-day weeks, 28-hour weeks, 32-hour weeks, full-time working weeks in their workplaces. So we have kind of shop floor knowledge as well as broader kind of like more policy design at a kind of larger scale. We've worked with governments in Spain, so the Valencian regional government, as you might have seen in the news, they are pushing for a regional rollout of a 32-hour week pilot, and this has now been taken to the Spanish national government. We are editing a document on the evaluation of a trial in Iceland across the public sector in Iceland, 2,000 employees reducing their working weeks by about 5 hours. It's not quite a 4-day week, but ultimately still a really significant shift for the majority of employees in the public sector in that country. And so I think the 4-day week, you know, when we first started working on the shorter working hours as a solution to a variety of problems that I'll come on to, that when we first started looking at this issue a few years ago, there was very little on the ground in terms of pilots, evidence, kind of movements, but now, partly because of the acceleration of the COVID pandemic, this has moved on significantly. So we have Spain, as I just mentioned, Iceland. Obviously, you've heard about New Zealand, I'm sure. Unilever and New Zealand are trialing a shorter working week. I don't think they'll go back to working the 9 to 5 as usual. Obviously, the New Zealand government also been making noises around this. Scotland as well, the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon bringing up the 4-day week in the recent debate. So this is really becoming more of a global issue, and I think it's something that we need to consider, particularly in the context of the history of working time reduction. You know, the weekend, for example, is something that came about just after World War II in this country, and it didn't come about by accident, didn't come about naturally, didn't come about from some kind of natural, you know, progression of industry. It came about because working people basically wanted more time for themselves. The weekend, you know, people were working 6-day weeks, 7-day weeks. ultimately, it was workers in a variety of industries saying, actually, as industry gets more productive, as we're working harder, and as more profits being made, we deserve time off. And now the weekend is something which we can all accept as a good thing, a thing which if it was taken away from us as full-time workers, it would be a scandal. That was 80 years ago when Roosevelt in America was making the New Deal, and he put caps on 40-hour weeks. That was around 80 years ago. It's important now that we make the next step. We continue working time reduction as a sign of progress, as a sign that, you know, as society gets wealthier, as we get more productive, as some of these technologies that Kyle was talking about, you know, machine learning and so on, comes into being, it's important that we think about how that can translate into basically better livelihoods, kind of better, more healthy lives across our society, particularly as we know that overwork's a huge problem. The Health and Safety Executive from last year, which actually plots sick days up until the COVID pandemic, so not including the COVID pandemic, shows that 17 million sick days were lost due to work-related stress, anxiety, and depression from 2019 to 2020. Burnout is a huge issue in our economy. In the UK, we work some of the longest hours in Europe, as I'm sure you know, and yet we're one of the least productive economies, or at least we're falling behind other economies such as Germany, the Netherlands, and so on, who work shorter hours than us. So it's not the case that productivity tracks working time. And in fact, presenteeism, as Claire mentioned, and absenteeism from sick days are a real blight on our economy. So that's a really important factor. How do we make technology work? Sorry, how do we make technology work for us? How do we make technology work for society, rather than just simply accruing profits to a small elite, to a small elite set of companies, the FANG group, Apple, Amazon, and so on? Well, one way of doing that is translating any productivity gains into working time reduction. Now, I'm going to, as I say, I'm going to keep this brief. There's much more we can go into, and I would advise you to go to the Autonomy website to see some of our reports on this, particularly the kind of profitability study we carried out for 50,000 different companies. But I think it's important to think about how we can make this happen. It's not simply about waiting for those first adopter firms, those kind of innovators to adopt shorter working hours in their firms, which I think is really important to do and point to the good practices that are out there. It's really important to celebrate those decent practices in the private sector. But ultimately, I think we're going to have a multi-pronged approach to reducing working hours across the economy. So the public sector is a good place to start. The government, for example, has control over working conditions in the public sector. Public sector employment is around a fifth to a sixth of national employment in this country. So it'd be a huge shift if you produce a roadmap for shorter working hours across the public sector. We've costed that at Autonomy. We've shown how much it would cost to create new employment to share the working hours out. So starting with the public sector, local authorities, NHS, and so on, really, really important, because working time is a huge issue in these workplaces. Burnout in the public sector, teachers, nurses, and so on, is worse than it is in other sectors. Trade unions, get the trade unions around the table with businesses and the government, basically. There's some trade unions, like the Communication Workers Union, they're already they have negotiated worker term reductions with Royal Mail over the next 4 years. That's a really significant achievement, and that's ultimately, it has been trade unions in the past who've created better work-life balance for everyone as a whole. So working with trade unions on those campaigns in different sectors to really negotiate shorter working hours, particularly as new technologies are introduced. And then, as I say, creating a wider business network and really like jumping on that best practice of the private sector is really, really important. Okay, I'm going to finish just thinking about other aspects beyond the 4-day week, which I think I was asked to speak about, which I think is really important. Some of the stuff that's already been picked up on. I think Claire and what the Melting Pot are doing is really, really interesting, and our Autonomy released a report last year called The New Normal, which is really designing workplaces, community workspaces, and thinking about what services they could provide. And it's great to see that Melting Pot actually doing a lot of that already. I think when we talk about remote work, we shouldn't just talk about the home. I think particularly because what Gail was mentioning around the home is not an equal place. Remote work doesn't just have to mean home work. It can also mean remote work from other spaces. And I think those spaces should become more available. And ultimately, I think local authorities should have a part to play in that. So when a local authority owns a space, and it could be leased out to, for decent rates to like cooperative co-working spaces, spaces where people can go to work, because the home might be a toxic space, the home might be an unequal space, and actually ultimately, those kind of tensions are ones which we should be able to give people an option to get out of. Going forward, a few just brief comments on the future of work and where how to create a more secure and equitable future for all, as Kyle was mentioning at the start. I think we have to look just not only in the workplace and the kinds of work and the pathways of work and the careers of work, but also look beyond that. So look at our social security system. You know, we're going to see a lot of churn in the labour market in the next few years, particularly, you know, who knows what the turmoil, the aftermath of Brexit's going to be. There's environmental catastrophe on its way, as well as Kyle was mentioning, an automation threat or promise, depending on how we engage with it. The social security system is not fit for purpose. Our welfare system is not fit for purpose. It was built in an age of a post-war industrialism where full-time male lifelong employment was the norm, and anyone dropping into unemployment was basically a kind of blip. Then once after a few weeks, few months, they'll be back into employment. That's not the case anymore. The Joseph Browntree Foundation and others have shown that the churn between unemployment and low pay is huge. It's increased by over 50% over the last 10 years. That's going to continue, and we need to have a much stronger income floor, whether it's a basic income, a minimum income guarantee, or anything like that. Anything which is universal, generous, and requires very little conditionality, that's something which will give people a floor to stand on, whether they need to take risks, as Kyle was mentioning at the start, whether they need to basically kind of build something new, or whether they just need to have a stopgap before they move to another kind of employment. It's the welfare system as it stands is simply not good enough. So I thought it's important just to mention that it's not just about in-work conditions, not simply about in-work pay and career progression. It's also about the kind of levels of support outside of the labour market as a buttress towards it, because we can't think the future of employment if we don't think what the future of unemployment is going to be, and that kind of the kind of temporary and long-term unemployment, and improving that is something which will help make the future of work something which is more equitable for all. I think I'll leave it there. We've got only like 7 minutes left for questions, so I think I won't take up any more time.
Thank you so much, Will. And we've had questions coming through. I know our speakers can stay in a little bit, so what I'm going to do is, rather than sometimes we ask speakers to all comment on the same questions, I'm going to kind of try and point my questions to individual speakers where I think that's best. If there's something really burning that you want to comment on, I'm not going to stop people, so do come in if there's something you want to add to people's comments, but just so we can fire through questions and cover as much ground as possible. So I'm going to perhaps start, if I may, I'll start with Kyle, because he's been quiet now for a while, so he's had a good chance for a breather, and then I'll come to Gail, Claire, and then Will in terms of the questions I've got at the moment. So I was really interested. We've had sessions before, Kyle, where we've touched on things like the 20-minute neighbourhoods, and I think the comment you made about is not sleepwalking into something and being conscious of our decisions as we move forward. And I'm really interested in the broader economic link between kind of the future of work, and how is it that it could potentially help areas where there's traditionally less employment opportunities, or we've got areas of low pay. And then the converse side of the future of work I wanted to look at there is, of course we're in Scotland, but London's always the strong example of how also do we balance high cost housing with low pay, and do we think there's something about the future of work that will have a real difference on how it can try and deal with some of those broader housing and low pay challenges, but also the producing employment opportunities in areas that perhaps have lost big industries or are really struggling. So a very broad question, but I know NESTA will have looked quite broadly at this issue, so I thought you were the man for this question.
Yeah, so there was, I don't know, there's a couple of questions in there. I'm not quite sure exactly what to pick up on, but talking around that area, there's some really interesting stuff that we have been looking at around partly the sort of escaping the city idea. So actually the shift in location. So some of my colleagues recently just did a report on this, and they found that yes, there is this kind of move away from the city, maybe not quite as much as reported. I know several people who have already, moved house, literally thinking, well, great, if I don't need to be in a city centre, I won't be. And I think that will remain, that will keep happening over the coming years. So although the early signs aren't maybe as much as we might have guessed, I think that's here to stay. We've also seen some of the, sort of big organizations in the country decide that they're going to shift things out of London and be more sort of spread across the country to have a higher number of smaller offices. So those changes, I think that's great news. not just, you know, in terms of the London effect, but actually for Scotland as well, in our cities, and having people in different places. It means that people are prioritizing their lives differently. It's not just, where is my office? Okay, I'll be chained to that. They can actually make choices about other things. So I'll put some links in the chat to that. There's a blog which is sort of 4 scenarios for the future of remote working, and there's a more in-depth report actually looking at economic sort of data to map some of this. So I'll put both of those things in the chat just now.
No, thank you, Carl. It's interesting. I mean, I'm based in Dumfries and Galloway, and as Claire was speaking, I think very much about that personal side of the office. You know, we're all kind of thinking about this in a very functional way, and a bit like Claire, I enjoy working from home, but I'm sure as soon as I suddenly meet people physically, it's going to take I'm going to have to hold everything back to not give people hugs, and, you know, because actually, you know, a lot of us are just desperate to make those connections and that kind of sense of collaboration. And I'll perhaps pick up on collaboration points with Claire in a second. But Gail, I just wanted to ask you just a question. Someone had posted in the chat about, is there a danger that perhaps some of those businesses that are looking to cut their office space are doing so more just to simply reduce costs rather than actually thinking of the broader well-being approach? And I think, you know, we heard people touch on that kind of, what's the impact on young people and the mentoring type space, and how does that affect people in overcrowded urban housing? You know, we're doing renovations at the moment. I joke about working from my bedroom, but actually for lots of people, that's been the reality in this, and actually isn't necessarily good for the mind to be working from your bedroom. So, you know, how do we make sure that when people are making future work changes, that they're not just looking at it from a cost perspective and looking at it with that much broader human touch? Actually, I'm just going to say it, human touch, because that's what we need to think about. And Claire, I can see you've got a comment on that. If that was your hand up, so if you want to come in after Gail, that'd be grand.
Yeah, sure. I think there is a danger. Certainly, it's one I'm very preoccupied with, partly because of looking at the inequalities of working from home and the kind of generational split that there is quite a lot in terms of the benefits that can be gained from working from home versus the things you lose in terms of socializing and networking and learning at work. So yeah, I think there is a danger, and that's partly why I would, you know, we're calling for governments to be a bit more proactive in setting out, you know, what is a kind of national remote working strategy? What is the place for government to try and influence the decisions that businesses themselves might make? I think we know we have a long-running problem in terms of worker voice in the UK, in terms of the long-term decline of workplaces being unionised, but also surveys indicating that more informal aspects of voice have not been very good over the last 10, 15 years. It has declined for most people. So I think there's a real risk that workers' views will not be adequately present in some workplaces. And that's where I'd like to see both, you know, the trade union movement itself, new civil society organisations and campaigns, and government trying to consistently point to the employee's needs as well. But I also think that many businesses, if you look at the data so far in terms of intentions to scale down office space, etc., it would seem to me that most businesses are trying to do it proportionately, and they do recognise the value that people get from going into offices. So I think it's overblown the extent to which businesses might just shut down all their office premises, but it is more concentrated in different sectors. Like the banking sector seems to be one where there is a huge rush to vacate massive high-rise offices and impose home working on people that don't really have any choice in it, which is, you know, anecdotally, as well as in the data, I know a few people that have been told they will never be coming back to the office, and that's just not acceptable. That's just a new frontier of one-sided flexibility that we need to try and avoid.
No, thank you. Claire, you had a comment, I think, around this as well. Oh, you've frozen. You're on mute.
Classic. Gail made some great points there. Effectively, we're in a pioneering stage. This is a whole new era, and there'll be a balance between what gets prototyped on the ground, what gets prototyped at strategy level, and then the stuff that emerges in between. So the new hybrid model, which will come about for many but not all organisations. It's not possible to do, you quick fit tire fitting by remote. Certain industries are going to do this. So we're going to be making things up as we go along, and some strategy interventions and suggestions from government would be welcomed. But I think people will vote with their feet unless employers are responsive to the needs of their employees. And I can think about that for my own organisation. Unless I look after my employees and they feel like they're getting what they want after we get through this initial shockwave of, oh my God, what is going on, then we'll lose good people. And young people and older people, it doesn't matter. You're going to be looking for all sorts of benefits when you join an organisation. So where I get to work, what the team culture's like. We've got a whole load of learning to do about working where it's hybrid, where there's a choice, not where we're all forced to work from home. We were all forced to work in the office with maybe a couple of people getting a tiny bit of token flexibility. So choice will come through and people will vote with their feet.
No, I think that's a really interesting point. We talk a lot about, I know when I talk about kind of supply chain and CSR type stuff and attracting talent in terms of big companies, in essence, the way that people are expected to work will be part of that talent acquisition, I think, in terms of attracting the right people to your organisation. Well, I wanted to go on, sorry, Claire.
Retention. Employers might want to get rid of their offices, but what they don't really want to do is get rid of their teams, not their good people. And so if they want to keep people, it's going to end up, any good employer is in dialogue with their staff about, what's the give, what's the get.
Yeah, I think that sense of a blended approach is going to become much more common, because actually a bit like you, people want the mix sometimes of working from home and the not distraction, but actually crave some of the collaboration. And again, I think in terms of young people as well, we have the direct stuff that we collaborate, but there's so much of the indirect collaboration that I don't think we've always thought through quite as much as we should. So the incidental chat over the kettle that actually ends up leading to a partnership that you never quite envisaged. And I know that's always a big part of the melting pot in terms of people from different backgrounds and organisations then coming together, that it makes a real difference on. And I think, again, we haven't really touched on that. We've spoken very much about collaboration within existing organisations, but to me, this is much broader in terms of how do we're not suddenly moving back into big conference spaces, big events, big ways for different people from different organisations to mix and meet. So is kind of co-working an opportunity to create those smaller scale collaboration and meeting opportunities that we're perhaps not thinking through as much at the moment? So lots going on. Will, I wanted to come on a question. It's come up. We've got 6 minutes still for questions. I think Duncan said we'll carry on for 10 minutes. So I'm hoping that's okay with everyone. It was a question really about the union side, and it's come through, I guess, strongly in terms of some of your work and the work that Gail's done about that kind of employer voice. Does the charity and non-profit social enterprise sector almost need its own kind of sense of union and stronger worker voice?
Yeah, I think almost every workplace, in fact, every workplace needs to have strong worker voice, because not only do the people who are working in these workplaces know their workplaces best and therefore should have some say in how they're how they operate, how to work best, but also because there's obviously clearly power imbalances between various members of staff on the shop floor and between shop floor management. That's just a basic fact in some sense. I think the charity sector and the NGO sector, I think while each sector has their own issues and their own kind of particular strains and so on, I think the sector which all of us seem to more or less be part of, it suffers often from a kind of you should love your work type thing. I think there's often a kind of the work ethic presents itself in our sector as a kind of, often can be a kind of like you're in this because you love it, because it's charity work or it's NGO work, and it's more of a kind of vocation. And I think that can be quite toxic, and people can put in some serious hours of overtime simply because there is a cause behind their work, and I think that can be quite toxic for people. And that's what I'm just going to point to Sarah Jaffe's recent book called Work Won't Love You Back, where she literally interviews charity workers and those who work in the NGO sector, and think about the certain pressures that they have, which other sectors might not have. There might be, physical demands on let's say construction and so on, but in the NGO sector we get that kind of like the labours of the heart as well as of the hands, as it were. So I think, yeah, it's always important to guard against that. It's important to that there can be a greater voice in that sector. I think IWGB, one of the smaller unions, has a charity workers branch, which I know a few of their members, and it sounds like it's a really promising and a lot of discussion. I think it's a very early days, but a lot of discussion from people who work in our sector, like a discussion of the particularities of their workplace. So yeah, I fully agree with that.
No, thank you. Well, you touched on some really interesting points there, particularly that, that sense of, because you're in business to help other people, in essence, how do you get a sense of a break from that, where actually in terms of mental support and your own well-being, that can actually be more critical, but how do you make sure you don't end up feeling a sense of guilt or letting people down? I think it's really important that we touch on in our sector. I'm going to just ask one more question just to you around the 4-day week. For me, someone asked a very practical question about more tools on that, and I think you've put some links to that in some of the chat, and we'll check. But I just wanted to pick up on the 4-day week just a little bit. So we're here to talk about it. We always just talk about a 4-day week, but is it compressed hours? Is it working for 4 days for the same salary as 5 days? Is it working 4 days on your wage? And again, I've seen some quite innovative approaches by different organisations where they said, actually, we can't afford to suddenly give everyone 5 days worth of pay for 4 days, but for those who are perhaps paid less within the organisation, we will absolutely make a commitment that if we're moving to 4-day week, they get the equivalent of 5-day salary on living wage, to try and get a balance. So how do we get that balance between the two, and what's your sense of, is the compressed hours model helpful, or is it actually a distraction from what the 4-day week's all about?
I mean, well, I think we touched on it just at the end there. I think it's more or less a distraction. I mean, to some extent, it might be a bit of a gateway drug to thinking about how we can work differently and work at different times. But I think in general, the point of the 4-day week, which is let's be clear, is more accurately, I guess, a shorter working week, i.e., like, let's say a 32-hour week. It could be spread across 5 days, depending on the nature of your work. But I think ultimately the point of the 4-day week or the shorter working week is to move to an economy of shorter working hours, such that we can see those benefits, not in terms of just freedom, but also in terms of working better, kind of greater kind of gender balance, because obviously most part-time work is done by women. Ultimately, if you can make part-time the new normal while retaining higher pay, that's obviously better for those who are on the lower end of the pay spectrum, but also those who have lower hours. So I think there's a whole range of reasons, but I think ultimately we should be very clear that we're talking about a reduction of the working week while retaining the same pay, as has been done in the past. So we didn't have drops in wages when we moved to a 5-day working week from a 6-day or a 7-day working week. So it's important to make sure that is the definition of a 4-day week. I think what's important here in terms of basically each sector is very different, and I think each strategy has to be basically built with consultation with those who work in these industries, and that obviously the representative of these often trade unions, but also has to work for employers as well to some extent. And so I think it's hard to answer a question particularly around broad practicalities, but for example at the moment you see a lot of desk-based work, a lot of office work. Those are the companies that are moving towards shorter working weeks because of the nature of their work is quite elastic. So you kind of you don't have to increase staff headcount really, and you can change how you work more efficiently and so on if you have that carrot at the end of the week, at the end of the stick. Whereas nursing, teachers, care workers, you will need to increase employment most likely because you simply can't do more of your job in shorter working hours. So there are differences, but ultimately let's have a roadmap, because that's ultimately something which we can all probably get behind as a good thing for our society if we move to that situation. I won't keep going on because we have gone over time. But.
Yeah, no, thank you. Very conscious we're over time. There's always a danger when we've got 4 great speakers, and I feel like I could carry on forever, but I know we've all got other things to do. So I was just going to perhaps go through and just give each of our kind of panelists and presenters a chance today just to give a final reflection and a final comment on today's session. So what's the thing that's perhaps most pertinent to them about the future of the office or the future of work? Because I don't want us to be thinking just about the one. So I'll go to Claire, then Gail, then Kyle, and then Will, just for a final comment from each of you for today.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I think the future of work is hybrid for white collar workers, and I would encourage employers and employees to think about what types of environment work well for them. Not everything has to fit everybody. You know, like find what works, test things out, go and explore. One co-working space is not the same as another co-working space. Don't think you've tried eating pizza when actually you've eaten curry. Like, go and experiment and find what works for you.
Thank you, Claire. Gail?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think just thinking about the future of work and the key battles and tensions ahead, I agree with Claire when she said we're kind of at the pioneer phase, and I think we should accept that different employers will have already gone through so many changes. And anecdotally, I think there's a lot of good that has come from the way workers and managers have had to be forced together to make changes over the last year and try and accommodate the needs of workers and the needs of businesses. But it will be continual trial and error, and I think hybrid working in particular will be a trial and error process until we settle on a new equilibrium. I just want to, I suppose, flag again what a perilous economic situation we're currently in, and just my note of caution around how we continue to fight for fair, flexible working is just, we need to keep pointing out how important this is to people's lives, to ensure that we don't get a new narrative of, any job is better than no job. Just take whatever job you're offered. People don't necessarily have the ability to vote with their feet if there is mass unemployment. So I do hope it won't be as bad as all that, but we're still very much in the eye of the storm. So we need to continue to champion good work across the income spectrum.
Thank you, Gail. Kyle, final thoughts from you?
Yeah, final thoughts. I agree with everything that's just been said, really. But I think when we've seen big changes in the past, and we've been quite surprised by results. So things like, changes to factory conditions in the past, giving people more time off, actually increased productivity, reduced costs on, through things like accidents and stuff. I think we can see the same in society now. We can reduce costs with things like ill health, with changing how we work. So there's huge opportunities to keep changing. Really agree with what Claire said, trying different things as we, everything's been thrown up in the air. We don't have to put the toys back in the same way that they came out of the box. Let's take this opportunity to change how we improve our workplaces.
Thank you, Kyle. And Will, just the final thoughts just from you.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think the way Kyle put it was actually, like you put it very well, actually. That the world of work has been thrown up in the air. Let's make sure it lands in the way that we want to be going, in the direction we want to be going in, basically. And I think, just on Gail's point, I think it's really important to recognise, let's not make the mistake after the 2008 crisis, where we basically accepted an austerity narrative that we can't have nice things, we can't have a future of work which is strong and sustainable and secure. Ultimately, this now is the time to be putting forward ideas for how to steer our economy in the right direction. So I think it's important to avoid that trap, as Gail mentioned.
Thank you so much. Thank you for staying on for the extra. I said 5 minutes, it's turned into 15. I'm really sorry. It's been a great session. I've already got so many thoughts and questions, and I'm sure this is a topic we'll keep coming back to. Like everyone's just said, we're all still experimenting a little bit with what the future of work will be, and I think there'll be lots of learnings as we kind of go back and we're trying. So you might have joined us already a few times, Claire, but I'm very sure you'll be back as things open up and we start talking. And again, to our other speakers, we know this is changing. Oh, and there's the glimpse of the melting pot. Hey, it's looking fab. Brilliant. Now I'm wanting to stop working from home and come in as well. Thank you everyone for today. We'll be back again next Wednesday, and thank you all for joining us, and have a great day. Thank you everyone.